Welcome back to another module of the workshop Developing Writing Tutors. What we're trying to do in this module is to pull together all the strings that we've been talking about. We've looked at learners, we've looked at learning strategies, we've looked at ways of teaching, we've tried to understand what goes into a process of writing. We've also looked at some of the genre agnostic aspects of writing, such as the rhetorical modes that students need to use or that writers in general need to use. And now the question for us is, how do we decide what we want our students to learn and how do we make that happen? Not only at the level of each session, because that always happens in the context of a larger decision that we have made, but how do we decide what is necessary for each course, for each studio, at each point in our students' lives? This is the introduction to the module, which hopefully will help you navigate through everything. And what anchors this particular module is a set of concerns that have come to us from conversations with teaching associates and academic associates and faculty, which concern our approaches specifically to reading and writing in the disciplines of architecture and design and built environment in general, but also including engineering and everything that connects us in this university. What we often talk about are concerns like how do we give the students enough without spoon feeding them? And the idea of spoon feeding seems to be a recurring thing, but also something that's often used as an excuse for us as tutors not to invest, not to provide all the things that we are supposed to provide in order to facilitate the learning process. And that's not to say that the decision is not a difficult one. It is difficult to decide how much to give and how much to expect of the students so that we develop in them the ability to also learn on their own. And even though we are now at a higher level institution dealing with adult learners, we should still keep in mind the kind of principles that we looked at earlier on. Principles which are fundamentally concerned with ideas like where is the student at the moment, how much would they have to do in order to reach where we want them to reach, and are they likely to need help with that? Because if that task seems too difficult, if that task seems too cumbersome, then they may not undertake it and they may not reach where we want them to reach. So then it's not a question of spoon feeding, but it's a question of facilitating which needs to happen. This is also a question that might distinguish the approaches we take as a teaching associate or academic associate and as a lecturer, as a resource person for a particular course or studio. So we keep this in mind as we move forward through the process of designing what we want our students to do. The other aspect that we need to keep thinking about, even as we talk about other steps, is the idea of making reading and writing relevant. They are not as immediately and obviously relevant as skills which are more directly seen as connected to the students' disciplines would be perceived. And side by side with this, we are concerned with making sure that the students feel that they have agency, they get to decide about how they want their learning process to take place within the limits available to us within our studio or within our course. And we make sure that the students are able to exercise this agency. They know they have it, they know they can make decisions, and we empower the people with whom we work, the people in our group, as equals to exercise that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that everything is a matter of opinion and preference. So there are certain non-negotiables that we need to set up, that we need to make clear from the beginning of our course, that function as targets that students need to achieve. And finally, we make sure that our students have access to the best possible resources and education because that is our fundamental responsibility. And at the same time, we set in place a system that allows us to deliver this without collapsing. Very often, our delivery does not suffice, perhaps because we're unable to identify the points that can be fine-tuned to make our work easier. So these are our goals for the module, and what we will look at is a learning process for reading and writing which we are responsible to designing, and which usually follows a particular sequence. Understanding and keeping in mind this sequence is essential, because if we invert the sequence in which we think about the learning process, we might be pulled in a direction that does not give us enough freedom. So the first step in designing any learning process, but particularly for reading and writing, which is where we have a bit less experience, the first step is always to define the learning outcomes that we want our students to achieve. We should be able to say very clearly, even before we start teaching a course or teaching a studio, that as far as reading and writing is concerned, we want our students at the end of the course to be able to demonstrate knowledge of, for example, a genre, something that is relevant to our discipline, like, say, a brief or a design intent. And we want our students to demonstrate the ability to write a clear brief, or to write a brief that communicates to a layperson. Whatever that learning outcome might be, we need to have that clear in our minds before we even decide anything else. We'll talk about how this is done during the module. The second step is to decide how we will measure whether the learning outcome has been achieved. The students will do what we ask them to do, but how will we know whether they actually have the knowledge that we want them to have and have the ability? So when they move forward, they are able to continue to do that. Deciding on when and how the learning outcome is going to be assessed, is going to be evaluated on how we will set the target and value each student's outcome according to that target. This is the second step, once again, even before we're looking at the process that will take the students there. Keep this in mind. These are steps that are usually missed out on. They're not articulated clearly enough, and they muddle up our processes later on. This is also what will help us take the next step, which is design the process. So if in step 2 we have arrived at a decision that says what we will do is to evaluate the learning outcome through an exam, then the process will be designed in a particular way. If, however, we're saying something like, we will evaluate whether the students have learned how to write this design brief or design intent by looking at an assignment that the students have submitted, the process will be different, right? So the jump from step 2 to step 3 requires us to think of every week, to think of every learning opportunity, and to decide what will the students give us, what will be the output, what will be the thing that they write or the thing that they read, and what will they submit to us, either in stages or as a final output, or all of them put together. But all of this not depending on what we like to read and what we enjoy, but depending very clearly on what is appropriate to that learning outcome. So if we want the students to know how to write a brief, then we do not need an output that is called an essay. We do not need an output that is called reading reflection. We will need an output that corresponds to the learning outcome. At the same time, when we design this process and when we decide the output, we need to make sure that we keep in mind the learners. So if the learners have to do this for the first time in their lives, then the output that we set for them, and obviously the learning outcome that we have decided on, will have to be fine-tuned to that. We cannot expect too much. If we set a target that is unachievable, then obviously our students will fail to meet the target. Which is why when we reach the point of deciding on the process and on the output that we want the students to produce, we have an opportunity to revisit and adjust the learning outcome, just in case we have gone wrong and we set expectations which are too high. But very often, the learning outcome, the same learning outcome, can be achieved through a variety of types of output. So if we are certain that what we want is a specific learning outcome, and the output that we initially conceptualized does not give us that, then the first thing to do, the first target is the output, not the learning outcome. So we don't directly change the learning outcome, but we try to see if there is a type of output which is easier to achieve, which is possible within the amount of time available to us, and we fix that as the manner of submission that the students will make, through which they will arrive at the learning outcome. And at this stage, it is important to also try to remember that an output in itself is not the same as assessing, is not the same as evaluating and measuring the learning outcome. When the output is part of the process, it is just like everything else in the process, it is a way for the students to practice, it is a way for the students to learn and to move towards achieving the learning outcome. It is only if the output becomes part of the assessment that it is a mechanism through which we measure whether the learning outcome has been achieved. So this distinction is something that this module is going to be concerned with. The next steps that we're going to take are to decide on what we have to give. What is the input necessary, both in terms of content and in terms of delivery. So for example, if we want our output to be a design intent, then we will have to tell the students what a design intent is. How should we do that? Should we do that through a class interaction, through a discussion, or by giving them a handout, or all of them put together? That's a matter of delivery. But the content that has to be given to them is knowledge about what the design intent is, right? Along with this, obviously we take step 5, which is preparing all the course materials. We have to put it all together, and we have to do this before the course begins, because otherwise during the course we will spend our time preparing course material instead of spending our time engaging with the students and providing feedback for what they have given us. And when I say course material, I don't just mean what goes into the input sessions, the PowerPoints or the handouts, but I also mean everything ranging from our grading rubric to our course policies to the framing of the assignments, everything that will make our course run smoothly. Why? So that right before the course begins or in the first session, we're able to share all of this with the students. Sharing all of this with the students brings us back to where we started, which is the point of transparency and the point of making materials available, making sure that the students have a support system. It is not spoon feeding, but it is ensuring that the learning process is democratic, that the students have control over when to read, that someone, for instance, who needs a little bit more time can take their time going through the material step by step at their own pace, has a chance to come and ask us, has a chance to talk to their peers. And finally, we conduct the course and see how things work and make the adjustments necessary. Defining the process so clearly is not to say that modifications and adjustments will not be made during the course. That happens, it's bound to happen, it's not a problem. But it is to say that we need to make an investment in that learning outcome, which you will see underlined and highlighted and in bold, and which we need to remember at every point. If we keep the learning outcome in mind, we are not swayed by small tweaks that need to be made. Why? Because we know that even if, for instance, an input needs to be changed, even if an output that we're asking of the students needs to be dropped, things can be adjusted to make sure that the same learning outcome has been achieved.